Economic commentators are obsessed by Brexit. Will there be a deal or not? What will the UK's trading relationship with the EU be? Will Nissan and other car makers leave? Will the big investment banks stick with London for their European headquarters? Now, let me tell you a secret. The UK economy? It's not about the Brexit. Welcome to the UK. By the standards of EU or European economies, it looks a pretty damn healthy place. Let's do some charts, shall we? Let's start with unemployment. In the UK, it's at a level last seen during the Barber boom 45 years ago. And let's look at it compared to other EU countries. Well, not quite top of the class, but damn near. It's well ahead of Spain, France, and Italy, and only a little bit behind Germany and the Netherlands. So, let's give the UK a big tick. Now, GDP growth. Let's set the clock to the end of the global financial crisis, say the beginning of 2010. Okay, the number of quarters of negative economic growth. In the UK, it's 2. That's even better than the US or Germany, and let's not even mention Italy or France or Spain or Greece or even Finland. Wow, another big tick for the UK. Next, growth in GDP per capita. You see, the UK has sucked in immigrants, and it may be that the economy has been growing, but it's all been absorbed by an increased population. And you know what? We've still done pretty well. The UK is below Germany and the US, but only fractionally. Basically, the British economy has, if not exactly roared, then at least purred, even as others have spluttered. Let's give the UK another tick. So, the EU, and particularly the Eurozone, is a sclerotic corpse, and we're best off out of it as soon as possible, right? Well, there's one problem, and the problem is that problem is a big problem. And that problem is that the UK's big problem is nothing to do with the EU. And that means Brexit isn't going to solve the UK economy's problems. Am I making sense? Okay, another chart. This is household expenditure as a percent of GDP. You what? You've got to love economists and their catchy names of things, don't you? Okay, this measures how much of a country's economy is taken up by households buying things. So down here we have Ireland, and I've chucked Singapore in so you can see what its economy looks like. Then between the mid-40s and the mid-50s as a percent of GDP, you have most European countries. Now, where's the UK? It's here, more than 10 points ahead of Finland or Switzerland or France. That means the UK economy is dominated by consumption. And I'd like to give you an example. Behind me is the Apple store on London's Regent Street. Busy, isn't it? Now, at this very moment, assuming it's not the middle of the night in London, there'll be people, perhaps dozens of them, going into that store and handing over their credit cards to buy iPhones. And who can blame them? Those people are contributing to the size of the UK economy. Let's add it up for a second. That person that unloaded the carton of iPhones from the plane, his wages, they're part of GDP. The guy who drove the lorry full of iPhones from Stansted to the store, his wages too. Oh yes, and the money spent on the diesel, that's part of GDP. The shop assistant who took your order, that too. The rent, the advertising, the store design, all that. It's all part of the economy. You borrowing £1,000 on your credit card to buy an iPhone, well, that probably added £250 to UK GDP. Congratulations, that's about 10 times more for the UK than was added to China. The UK economy is a consumption machine. We borrow, we spend, and because we're all employed in crucial productive roles like advertising products for us to spend our borrowed money on, or borrowing the money from abroad, or organising the transportation of products made abroad, we have a booming economy. If it sounds a bit like I'm being sarcastic, well, that would be because I'm being sarcastic. More charts. I know, I'm chartastic today. This one is OECD data on household savings rates. At the far end, see those big bars? They're countries where people save a lot, an awful lot. If we're going to be honest about this, these countries save too much. And next to me, you have countries that save too little, or according to the OECD, don't save at all. And that would be the UK. Let me be clear. Switzerland, Sweden, Germany and the Netherlands have problems too. It's not healthy to save so much and to be so dependent on external demand. But these countries have one big advantage. It's a lot less painful, and I mean an awful lot less painful, to save less than to save more. You see, when Brits start to save more, that means they'll be buying fewer iPhones. And when they buy fewer iPhones with money borrowed from abroad, that means there'll be less GDP generated by consumption. And that's going to be a painful process. But for now, forget about it. Now, in the old days, men were real men, women were real women, and economists and investors cared about current account balances. Nowadays, nobody cares. Imbalances pile up and it's okay. The UK can always borrow a few tens of billions to spend on yet more iPhones and generate yet more empty GDP. Last chart time. I want to put this all in context for a second. Now, back in the mists of time, say 1974 when I was born, the UK as a nation was accredited to the world. British firms and individuals owned properties, companies and foreign government bonds. Every year, dividends and rent payments, interest would arrive from other countries. This meant the UK could run a mild trade deficit, and no matter, it was covered by remittances from British assets abroad. So, back in 1974, there were net payments to the UK of $14.9 billion. That is what Brits received on their overseas assets, less what we sent to foreign owners of UK assets. That was equivalent to 7.2% of GDP. Neat, huh? But because of our profligate ways, the UK is no longer a net creditor to the world. Persistent current account deficits and the sale of UK assets have flipped this. The UK now owes more to the world than the other way around. Between 2014 and 2016, just 3 years, the UK sent abroad almost $250 billion more in interest, rent and dividend payments than it received. So for our current account to balance, we don't just need to export as much as we import, which for the record we don't, we also need to pay interest on what we owe to the rest of the world. How has this come about? Well, the British government has run persistent deficits, British firms have borrowed to buy back stock to goose their company's share prices, Singaporean dentists have bought off-plan apartments in London to rent out, and British consumers? Well, British consumers have been the biggest borrowers of all. According to accounting firm PwC, unsecured personal debt in the UK grew by 11% last year, reaching a record £300 billion. I want to put that in context for a second. The UK economy increased in size by £60 billion last year, while unsecured personal debts alone grew by £35 billion. That's not the sign of a healthy economy. That's the sign of a dangerously unbalanced one. Now, calling the end to anything is a mug's game. Right now, foreigners are happy to fund the UK's current account deficit. Money flows in to buy UK government debt. Money flows in to buy British firms like Arm. Money flows in to buy expensive London property. And all this helps pay for yet more iPhones. There's a famous line from Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises. When asked how he went bankrupt, Mike says, gradually, and then suddenly. I'm not suggesting the UK is going to go bankrupt, but discontinuities tend to be sudden and hard to predict. The UK attracts investment because it's seen as a strong economy, and this allows it to sustain an unsustainable model. For now. So then, let's talk about how it ends. Lenders are happy to lend when they see everyone else lending and debts look affordable. Things go wrong when there's a feedback loop. Lenders worry and demand slightly higher interest rates. This makes debt slightly less affordable, so lenders worry more and demand yet higher rates. Rinse and repeat. In this case, the impetus can come from one of a number of factors. Firstly, it could come from the rest of the world spending more. You see, right now, German and Singaporean and Dutch and Swiss savings are recycled back to the UK. If Germans decide to spend more, and there's currently no sign of this, then the interest rate in the UK must rise. Simply, UK interest rates are held down by fearful foreigners who aren't spending. Secondly, it might be a drop in UK confidence. Right now, consumers aren't fearful. If they suddenly became more fearful, perhaps because of an external shock, and started to save at a slightly higher level, well, the impact of that would be lower levels of household expenditure and a smaller economy. This is exactly what happened in Spain during the Eurozone crisis. Households had borrowed and spent because they had so much equity in their homes and they felt secure. And then suddenly they didn't feel secure anymore. They saved more and the economy entered a deep recession. That could happen in the UK. Thirdly, it could come from a drop of confidence in the UK. Right now, the UK is a relatively safe haven economy. It has relatively healthy demographics, it has London, it has a grown-up leader who seems disinterested in Twitter. Basically, it's a sensible place. But imagine you're a Swiss private banker. Now ask yourself, do you want to lend money to the UK government or a British bank if Jeremy Corbyn were to come to power? Now, the UK is still a relatively safe place, but perhaps a tiny bit less safe than before. Maybe there'd be a tax on banks that meant they might struggle to pay you back, or maybe there'd be an explicit goal to devalue the pound. All these things would make you a tiny little bit less likely to want to lend money to the UK and therefore result in a higher interest rate. Fourthly, it could come about through rising inflation. Imagine that the UK labour market tightens further for some reason. Good news for wages, but it also means upward pressure on prices. Or imagine that sterling weakened further, meaning imports of natural gas and oil got that much more expensive. Rising prices means price inflation, and that means that interest rates would also have to rise. None of these things are certain, and timing them is fiendish. But I do want to leave you with one last chart. Yeah, I said no more, but I lied. This is the UK government's own data on the household savings rate. See here, this is the period from 1989 to 1992. During this period, the savings rate increased from 6.6% to 14%. That was a horrible shock to the UK economy and resulted in the second worst recession of the past 50 years. Okay, now look here. This is the global financial crisis. What happened there? That was caused by people getting scared and not spending. Not spending is a euphemism for saving more. For an economy like the UK's, a rising household savings ratio will mean a recession. And given our debt levels and how unbalanced our economy is, it will likely mean a serious one. I don't know if you've noticed, but I've managed to do an entire piece on the British economy without mentioning the B word. Not even once. It genuinely terrifies me how little understood the fragility of the UK's economic model. Politicians, journalists and business leaders seem united in their decision to ignore data that should worry them enormously. Some good news. There are things we can do. There are measures that will make the UK economy more resilient and more balanced. The problem is that the government is rather obsessed with something else. And in any case, free owls are more popular than financial prudence. I will return to the UK in a future video and talk about what we can do. But for now, I'd like to ask you a favour. I'd like you to click share and like and subscribe. I'd like you to comment, ideally with something that would bolster my fragile ego. You know, like, wow, that was one of the most interesting pieces I've ever watched, or some such. And then if you're British, I'd like you to defer the purchase of your next iPhone. And if you're German, you might want to consider buying too. Thanks for watching and goodbye.